Hello, good morning everybody. Welcome. You feel quite far away here in the front. I don't know, you feel like there should be some closer chairs. Anyway, we're here to talk about peat, or the reduction, elimination of peat. We've got a really great panel of hugely knowledgeable people, some of the most knowledgeable people I know in the world. So I'm Ben Raskin. I'm the head of horticulture and agroforestry at the Soil Association, background in commercial growing. And I know we seem to have been talking about phasing out peat almost forever. And I sometimes feel we've made no progress at all. So the Innovative Farmers Programme, which Becky's going to talk to you a little bit once we've heard from our speakers, the very first field lab we did 12 years ago was about propagation compost and using biochar. And Tolly will tell you about another one that we did with him using his wood chip compost. So it kind of, you know, I do feel we've moved on, and yet we definitely haven't moved quickly enough. You know, there were days when it was used as a soil improver, you know, for which it's not even very good. So we've definitely moved on a bit from there. And, you know, when I was growing 20 years ago up in the Welsh College of Horticulture, we were doing peat-free nursery stock for the National Trust, you know, and we did it quite successfully 20 years ago. So there's certain things, nursery stock, you know, soil improver, there's no excuse really for using it in those situations at all. But actually for propagation, it isn't necessarily as easy as it seems, even though the technical challenges might not be the biggest problem. But it's this super tank. We've built our whole horticultural system around the cheapness and the ease of use and the reliability of peat. You know, we've got blocking systems that rely on peat. We've got understanding of how stuff grows. It's uniform, it's cheap, and all the rest of it. So we're used to using it, and changing mindsets and changing systems is not always easy. So we're going to see, I think, the way we're going to look, Margi's going to set the scene for us, sort of see where we are in terms of sustainable growing media. We're going to hear from Tolly, who's done, you know, some really great stuff showing that it's perfectly possible for you to produce your own alternatives. And then Jill, I think, is going to cover a little bit more about the challenges of scaling up, and where's all this stuff going to come from? We're not using peat. We need quite a lot of organic material to try and supply this, and it needs to be consistent. And that's the big challenge, I think, historically, is there's been some good peat-free compost, and there's been an awful lot of really bad stuff. And actually, even the good manufacturers have some bad batches. And as commercial professional growers, it's really hard. You know, you need to rely. You can't afford to have your crop not germinate and not be there for you. So getting that consistency and reliability, I think, is the key. So with no further ado, I'll let them introduce themselves more fully, but Margi will kick off for us.
Right. Is my mic on? It sounds like it. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. I would first of all like to thank the organisers for organising this session, for inviting me here to talk today. Creating a change to peat-free horticulture is a topic very close to my heart, and it has been the whole part of my professional career. I worked on this, so you can see it's been very unsuccessful, but I think we are almost getting there. So it's great to be able to share that with you. So I'm really here today to urge you all that we really agree that it is really time now that we phase out the use of peat completely in our sector. That's what we need to agree on. It should have really been done on New Year's Eve as a New Year's resolution for this year, but let's agree it here today. I'm sure many of you would agree, as organic growers, that this is long overdue, but we still are using some peat in our sector, and I think we just need to make sure that we don't. So I work, hang on, I just need to go through here. I work at the Centre for Agroecology, Water and Resilience at Coventry University, but on the topic of peat, I also work for the Royal Horticultural Society, and it's on behalf of both of these organisations that I've been involved in a project called Organic Plus, which has recently been completed. So that was an EU-funded research project led by Coventry University, where we have worked on various contentious inputs, everything from copper to mineral oils to peat, basically. At Coventry, the project involved primarily working on removing plastic mulches, non-organic manures and peat, and I was specifically involved in the work of peat. But I would like to acknowledge my colleagues at Coventry, Ulrich, Francis, Judith, Dennis and Sam, I think, who are amongst the, who are here at the conference at least, who have been involved, and I will talk with some of their work as well. So I'm sure you're all aware that there are many environmental reasons why peatlands need to be protected. In the past, when we first started on this in the late sort of 80s, the campaign was very much about protecting the unique habitats and the biodiversity of peat bogs. But today, with the climate emergency, the debate has been much more focused around the role of peatlands in mitigating and adapting to climate change. So, for example, in flood management or water management, and also providing a sort of a natural defense against flooding, and of course also in the absolutely massive stores of carbon that is locked away in peat bogs, and carbon that we really can ill afford to bring out into the atmosphere at this stage when we are sort of driving towards a zero carbon economy. So that's really what's driving the changes today, I feel. So in my view, we need, as organic growers, really need to act with some urgency here, so that we as soon as possible can claim that we are completely peat-free in our sector, as I said before. Ideally, I would like for us to do so now, but I do realise that can't happen overnight. We still need some lead-in time. We still need to resolve some I would say, rather very important but very small sectors where we still are dependent on peat, for example, for growing transplants in blocks, which Jill will talk about later. But it is important that we set our targets so that this actually does happen soon. And in my view, the target we should aim for is 2025. That's when we should be peat-free in the organic sector. Now, that would enable the organic movement to take a lead on this issue. You know, even after 25, 30 years, we could take a lead, and to reaffirm that organic growers operate to high environmental standards. At the very latest, it now needs to be at 2028, because that's when it's going to be made illegal in the conventional sector. But and I'm sure you would agree with me, that it would be a really bad look for organic horticulture if we were still using peat and they weren't doing that in the conventional sector. So let's get on with it. So to move away from peat, we need to identify alternatives that are both fit for purpose. They, of course, need to work, and they need to be responsibly, as we tend to call it here, or sustainably sourced. In the UK, the work on phasing out peat in both the commercial and conventional sectors, the initiative has been led by an industry-led initiative and called the Responsible Sourcing and Manufacturing of Growing Media Initiative. That scheme was set up already in 2011 in response to when the government set targets for phasing out peat. So the industry basically got given the charge to phase it out yourselves, basically, do so. So the scheme was set up, and the scheme is coordinated by the Horticultural Trade Association in collaboration with the Growing Media Association, or the Growing Media Manufacturers Association. And it involves various industry partners, obviously the growing media manufacturers, the growers, retailers. There's been some environmental representatives from environmental organisations, myself included, and then it's been heavily supported by Defra as well. But it's not Defra-led, it's led, so if you like, by the industry. So since 2011, the group has worked on various tasks to facilitate the phase-out of peat. So that has been to identify materials that are available at sufficient quantities, but also to develop this fitness for purpose test, so that to ensure that all new media that came on the market, or all media on the market, should have been tested, that they actually work. It's a fairly simple test, but at least we know that the media are not phytotoxic or going to get the plants growing. But then they've spent a lot of work developing this, what's called a responsible sourcing scheme. And so that's really to see at the environmental and social credentials of the alternatives that we develop. And that was, of course, to ensure that we don't replace peat, which has its environmental problems, with another material that have different environmental or social problems. So when I say that the scheme has been driven by the industry, it hasn't been a fast ride, I can assure you. It's been a really frustratingly slow journey, and we can discuss why that is later. But nevertheless, I'm pleased to say that the scheme is now in operation. So from last year, you could basically go out on when you buy a bag of growing medium, you can look at point of sale contact to work out how that medium scored in the responsible sourcing calculator, basically. So I'm just drying out here. Cheers. So to assess the responsible sourcing credential of a growing media, a calculator has been developed, and that considers the whole supply chain of the bulky or materials, so not the fertilizers in the growing medium, but all the bulky materials like the compost, the bark, or the coir, or whatever it is. The starting point of the supply chains depends on the type of material. So for a coir, it would be the production of the coconuts. That's the starting point. For a waste material, it's where the waste is being created. The end point of the supply chain is always at the mixing table of the growing media manufacturer. So it doesn't take into account any travel after the mixing table, if you like, or purchased by the consumer. So the assessment is based on 7 criteria. You can see them listed here if you can see them. And for each of those, there is a decision tree where you basically go through for all the bulky agents one at a time, and you score them against how much energy and how much water they've used in their supply chain. And it's very detailed. It's not a rough and ready thing to do. You really have to go back to the production of the coconut, see how much potable water was used for that, all the way up to the supply chain. So you need to really look at the records for the production change. And then, so each material is then scored on 0 to 20, 20 being the best. And then you can then work out the overall score for a blended medium that contains a mixture of various bulky ingredients. So the main ingredients that are being used today in the whole horticultural sector, including not only in the organic one, are basically bark, coir or coconut dust, green waste compost, normally referred to as green compost, and more recently, or in the last 10 years, we've seen all these new wood fibres. That's really become the major ingredient, and that can be either extruded wood, which I thought I had a picture of, but perhaps we've gone past that. It looks like basically looks like wool, basically, or it can be more composted, finer milled wood materials. And this is basically how they score according to the calculator under the various sections. And then also recently there are more anaerobic digestate fibre that's being used as well in some of the more recently produced growing media. Crucially, it's important that most commercial media that has been developed, and particularly the new generation, oh my goodness, of media, they have been produced for conventional production. So they have got artificial fertilizers. They are not suitable for use by organic growers. And I think that's where we need to so we would like materials perhaps containing the same bulky ingredients, but we want there to be more inherently nutrients in the growing medium generally. We want the medium to be biologically active, and ideally we want it to be sourced from local materials. So I'll skip through this because I'm being told so there you see the fibre. So in Organic Plus, we have taken a step forward. We don't only want to replace peat necessarily with other input substitution. We want to particularly work at a longer term on farming solutions. So we've been using local on-farm resources to replace peat, like composted plant or animal products that are normally produced on farms, like manures and wood chips. And we've also had a partner working on producing extruded wood from local forestry byproducts. and that's been composted. And in organic past, we've been testing how they perform as peat-free in a medium. And then the aim is more to produce recipes and protocols for how those could be produced on farm. I think in the short term, we probably will be much more input substitution that we will need. So, for example, in the UK, we've been testing the wood chip compost that Tolly is going to talk about in a minute, and I won't go into how that's been produced, but that's a lot of the work at Coventry has been based on that. And as you can see, the wood chip compost, we've taken, as an academic exercise, that through the calculator. And you can see that scores really well. You can see that there are lots more dark green scores than even compared with green waste compost. So it is more sustainably, more responsibly sourced. I don't think what I was going to do is just show you. The problem we've got is that, or the problem is we've identified, was that when Tolly uses that as a growing medium, he would normally take the wood chip compost and mix in vermiculite to various degrees. And although vermiculite hasn't been scored in the calculator yet formally, it is likely to come up, or it will come up with some very red scores. It's a mined material, so it has a large impact on biodiversity and habitat where it's mined. It's a non-renewable resource, so it will always score a red on that, and it's also likely to score a very high score for energy use. So mixing that in means that the overall score for even the homemade compost is going to be significantly hampered by that. So at Coventry, we've been testing substituting the vermiculite for, in this case, wood fibre. I think I will miss that because you're probably going to talk more about how that needs to be, how that can be done, and we can come back to discuss how that works. But this is my final slide, and it's really just to talk about, this is how I see how our roadmap needs to be for phasing out peat. We need to continue to work with growing media industry to adapt and reformulate some of the materials. It's a real shame that many of the new generation media are not available for organic growers. There are some really good wood fibre-based products that could be made available. And they could easily be made available. At the moment, the manufacturers don't think there is sufficient demand for it. So if we create a demand or tell them that there is demand, that could be done. And that would then, and then we would need to work to make sure that they are sort of effectively used in the organic systems. And then there are some areas where we especially need to find replacements, and Jill, as I said, Jill will come back to that, talking about media that we can use to produce for growing transplants in blocks, basically. That's where we still have a problem. But let's try and set some clear targets so that, you know, I think if we agree on that, we should basically try to, I think we can get there, but at least by using input substitutions by 2025 to phase it out. And that would then coincide with what's been said by the RHS. It's been coincide with what's said in the Soil Association at the moment. So then we will be 3 ahead. And we will be 3 years ahead of the conventional sector to phase it out. In the meantime, we need to continue to work on these sort of more system solutions. And I think by 2028, we might even be able to do some more system redesign, perhaps grow things in other ways than in blocks if we can't find a solution to that. And that means that we will also be a step ahead. We have growers who grow even more sustainably and source their materials even more responsibly. So, are you all up for agreeing that 2025 is our target? Can that be your belated New Year's Eve resolution? Come on, come on. No, we didn't hear you. All right, let's do it. Let's do it. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Margi. So I think that set the scene and laid down the challenge. So I'm going to ask you to hold off on questions, and I hope those of you that are joining from the live stream enjoyed that as well. And if you can start feeding some questions in, if you've got them, we'll be collating them and doing questions once all the speakers have gone through it. So I'm going to hand over now to Tolly. He doesn't care if you can see the slides.
Can you hear me, yeah? One of the problems with such a well-organised conference is you have to send your presentation in weeks ahead of when you do it. Now, years ago, I used to creep in at the back the session before and kind of get the presentation and go, so you remember what you're going to talk about, which is why I need to be able to see the screen. Otherwise, I've forgotten what it is I'm doing. Right. Yeah, here we go. Okay, now we've been dabbling in... I really don't want to use the word compost because we have a terminology problem in this industry about propagation media. So I'd rather try and use the word substrate or media if we can try and keep to that. We've been dabbling in substrates for a very long time. In fact, we started way back in the 70s, and we used to go out into the field and pick up molehills because they were beautifully friable bits of soil, and add peat and a few other bits and pieces, most of which didn't turn out to be particularly successful. Eventually, when I moved to Harbury, I kind of gave up peat because I had this paranoia about peat. And I felt that giving up peat was probably the right thing to do. So we looked at alternatives, and we tried cocoa shells and all sorts of weird and wonderful things. Again, none of which really worked very well. And it wasn't until we got onto wood chip that things really started to improve. And what we're trying to do with our substrate is we're trying to achieve an impossible product in that we are going to put into a very, very small container enough feed and nutrition to keep the plant growing for maybe 4 or possibly in the case of allium 6 or 8 weeks. This is a tall order to do organically. So we're looking at something which is a balanced supply, available, has to be cheap, which is peat has been really good on. It has to be stable in modules. We don't want something which is going to fall out. It needs to have all the necessary micro and macro nutrients. And I put the question mark on soil fauna because until recently, most producers of substrates would not like the idea of massive amounts of soil biology in their substrate because it would be seen to be possibly disease-ridden. I think fauna, soil biology is really important. This is what we expect. We expect nutrient, moisture holding, light, no weeds. We don't want weeds in our material. We need to be renewable. It needs to be cheap. It needs to be available. And we've been growing plants in our own material now, and I'm really pleased that Margi scored it fairly well, apart from the vermiculite, for a long time, in fact, over 20 years. And during that time, we have produced around 2 million plants. We have never had a failure. I think that says a lot. I wouldn't say it's 100% successful every time, but we've not had a crop failure. So it does work, and we expect a lot from this substrate. It's a tall order. The Dutchley trials propagation, what we did there was really to try and match our substrate against other materials, and we were using the industry standard, which is Classman, and we dabbled also with biochar to see if there's any big differences there. We came out very comparatively in terms of the trials against the other control. The results were almost identical. There was a few minor differences. So we were kind of felt confident that what we were doing with wood chip was actually quite viable and was working. And I'll tell you more about how we do it in a minute. The material cost. Now, growers are and farmers are very sensitive about cost, of course, particularly so now, and this is important. So we have looked at the cost, and you probably can't see it. I've done one of these terrible things which I really shouldn't do. I put a whole lot of figures up that you can't see. I hope you can access this at some point later, but what we've got down to with our total cost, and this is making our own substrate from the raw material through the whole process right up to the point of using it at source. We're looking at around 100, no, this is material cost including the growing of the plants. So we came up with a figure of £193 per 1,000 plants, which is a little bit more than Jill would be probably expecting you to pay for her plants. So we are actually higher cost in terms of making our own substrate and the plants that go with it. The big figure really is the labour in terms of plant raising, and that also is labour for substrate production. Modules or bare roots, peg plants. Everyone's kind of forgotten about peg plants. Now, When I first came into industry in the 70s, Dr. Bob Hiron, who I think was at Curtin Experimental Station, developed this module, am I right? Had developed this modular system for raising cauliflower because the supermarkets were demanding very much programmed production. They wanted cauliflower every possible week of the year, and to do that you have to manage the whole system right from the plant right the way through to harvest, and that includes the substrate. So he came out of a system of growing plants in modules. Up to that point, nobody'd ever grown field plants in modules. They were always grown as peg plants. They were grown in a seedbed, in a field, mechanised, and grown in very large numbers. I think we've forgotten how this used to be done. There is no perceptible difference between growing a cauliflower from a peg plant or from a module plant. Peg plant, a bare root transplant. They were always called peg plants. I'm not sure why they were called peg plants. Maybe somebody knows. I don't know, because they look like a peg, perhaps. There is no discernible difference, but somehow we kind of got hooked on this idea of everything has to be grown in modules. Up to that point, up to the 70s, the only plants grown in modules were really things like tomatoes, peppers, lettuce. Everything else was grown as a peg plant. And I think we've gone away from that, and we are now experiencing a huge rise in the cost of growing our plants because we are using modules. I mean, in our instance, it's costing us £193 a thousand to grow plants, whereas if we grow them as a peg plant, that cost is very, very much reduced. It's much, much cheaper. And I think we've got incredible differences also in terms of pest and disease resistance. Here are the pros and the cons. So the pros are less seed. This is for modules. You use less seed in modules. This is the other thing about the move towards modules. I think this has been driven also by the high cost of hybrid seed. We still use modules for hybrid seed because we don't want to risk expensive seed in the ground, which may only get a 50% germination rate. We're looking at 95% germination rate. So this is another way we've been pushed into using modules. So we use less seed in modules. It suits automated planting. It can be fully automated. You've got total control. Whereas with the cons, you've got very high energy input. So we have to have these expensive systems of greenhouses and climate control in order to grow these modules in trays. Particularly the larger the scale you go, the higher tech this becomes. Very high energy input. This has really suddenly become pertinent. You know, the number of greenhouse growers this year that aren't going to put their crops in because of the high cost of energy is quite worrying. High material input. You know, growing in a system means trays, it means electricity, it means a whole system. You've got infrastructure, you've got lots of embodied carbon. It's an expensive operation. And then you've got very elaborate facilities in terms of handling. The bigger the scale goes, the more elaborate this has to become. And you've got increased pest and disease problems. And this is, you know, one of the critical factors, particularly in organic situations, that these pests and disease may be difficult to control. The picture here is just a few, these are peg plants. These are some of our cabbages we grew last year. They're grown in a seedbed. They're ready to go out. They're in bundles of 25. There's rows there going to get pushed in by hand. We don't grow more than about 50,000 brassica a year, so a lot of it we actually do by hand because it's small amounts at a time. How long have I got left? Yeah, they're growing in seed beds. Maybe I might come to that in a minute. If not, I'll come back to you. Right, peg plants, the pros and cons. The pros are they're cheaper, hugely cheaper. And I've put a price on this. It will vary from farm to farm, but we're looking at about £25, £30 a thousand. The bulk of that cost is in the harvesting of the plants, the pulling up and the bundling up, the grading. That's the main cost. The actual growing cost is very low. They are hardier. Now, this may seem a surprise because if you put a module into a field, it looks nice and green for a week or two, and then it kind of stops. It doesn't grow for ages. It sits there doing nothing. Whereas a peg plant looks as if it's going to die in the first 2 or 3 days. It just collapses, you know, and it looks really sad. And then suddenly it kind of picks up 3 or 4 days later, it picks up and it races off because it's in a situation of extreme stress. It has to get its act together. The module is quite happy to sit in a little module with all its fertilizer and its nutrients and do nothing. And often the roots don't progress beyond that module. The roots will stay in that module, and this can actually inhibit the crop quite a lot. So peg plants in that respect are far superior. They're hardier. They will suffer drought better than a module. Once the module dries out, it's very difficult to water it. And they're very shallow. They're small modules, they're not planted deep. Peg plant is planted deep. We plant them up to their armpits, get them in really deep, and then they're into moisture. Reduced energy. There's much less energy in producing peg plants because basically it's a tractor or a hand seed drill, and that's it. There's none of the infrastructure goes with it. Flexible plantings. You can hang on to peg plants in a nursery bed for quite a long period of time. In fact, occasionally when we've been unable to plant, 2012 was an example, it rained all summer, we just mowed them off and then eventually plant them, when conditions were right. You can't do that with modules. They're going to suffer badly. The cons are you need more seed, and this is back to the problems of high cost of hybrid seed. You need some irrigation in order to get the seed bed established, and the irrigation, if you're a sensible grower, you don't do it without irrigation anyway, so you have to have that. You will need crop covers. We use crop covers primarily for flea beetle control, because flea beetle are a big problem, particularly in the summer, but also pigeons. Pigeons are our main pest is pigeons. It's less mechanised. The harvesting of plants is done by hand. There is no mechanisation that I know of for that. You can lift them mechanically, but you still have to grade and bundle them. Labour for planting will be slightly higher. So this is the pros and cons between modules and peg plants. And I wanted to put this in because a lot of growers are really super dependent on modules when they could actually be doing peg plants at much, much less cost and possibly better results as well. 5 minutes, right, okay. So the facilities you need for bare roots, hopefully I'll cover your query. Soil, well, okay, that's pretty obvious. You need a site, you need a field. We do it with a rotation. Most of our peg plants we grow in the wall garden. It's sheltered. We've got instant access to watering. Basically where our labour hang out more, it's more easily controllable. Here we have a few rows. This would be brassicas. We tend to keep the brassicas in a rotation because of problems of disease. We do the same with alliums. You need some cultivations. We're not doing big, heavy-duty tillage. It's very shallow, minimal tillage. You need a seed drill of some type. We've got several seed drills, one of which is almost 100 years old, which occasionally gets used. You need crop covers. You need handling equipment, which is probably not much more than a wheelbarrow or a link box on the back of the tractor. You need some weed control and you need irrigation. I mean, these are things which most growers understand and are happy to deal with. If you're growing crops already, you can grow peg plants, I'm sure. The yields per 30-metre row. Our wall garden is set up in 30-metre rows. For me, it's 100 foot. I still think in imperial quantities. 100 foot is easy. It's about how far you can crawl on your hands and knees without having to get up. So for every 30 metres, with leeks, we're getting around 2,000 to 3,000 plants. So we're sowing around 4,000 to 5,000 seeds in order to get that. Very high seed density. The more seed you put in, the less work you have hoeing and weeding and harvesting. So 1 acre will give you around 1.2 million plants. And that will plant up about 15 acres. So it's 1 to 15. So if you have an acre of peg plants, I'm not suggesting anybody would do so many, but if you did, that would do about 15 acres. It will vary from year to year. With brassica, the numbers are slightly different. Per 30-metre row, we're getting around 600 to 750. Target population is important because you want good plant development. So an acre will plant up about sort of 10 acres. So it's 1 to 10. It gives you some idea. I think I'm getting near the end. Yeah, I've done that already. But yeah, this was the trials, and we used brassica and leeks in the trials. Leeks are particularly difficult in modules because of the lack of nutrient. They run out of steam very quickly. Yeah, this is one of those awful graphs that you should never put up. I mean, really, what this is showing, the green bit is our wood chip compost, and the brown bit is Classman compost. And this is really about looking at the main elements. So we've got calcium, chloride, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, sodium. I mean, the two products are so different now, like chalk and cheese. If you were to present our nutrient figures to a conventional plant raiser, he'd be horrified. You can't grow in this. This is never going to work, but it does work. So it's not about, it's not about the nutrient analysis, which is important. Compost on the wood chip. This is wood chip as opposed to ramule chip wood, which we use in a different way. Wood chip is waste from tree surgeons. Don't ever try to use waste from joinery workshops. Sawdust is a nightmare to use. It's the worst possible material. Don't use sawdust or wood chips or wood shavings from joinery workshops. It has to be live wood. And this is coming from tree surgeon. We compost it. It's another story about composting, but if you go online, you'll find me talking about this in great depth at one of our conferences in Bristol. And it has to be thoroughly composted. We are composting this material for up to 2 years. The source material, you can either have your own coppers, which is the ideal arrangement because you've got complete and total control. We have coppers which I planted up 15 years ago. It's willow, it's white willow. It's incredibly productive. It makes the most beautiful compost, but most of it goes to ramial chip wood, but it does make really good substrate as well. It's a wonderful material. So you can either grow your own, which is the ideal arrangement, or you can get it from hedges and whatever woodland you have on your farm. I mean, we're increasing the area of woodland on our farm purely because we need ramial chip wood and we need compost. So it is available. If you don't have it on the farm, it's available usually somewhere fairly close. Right, that's it. Thank you very much.
Dropping everything. Thank you, Tolly. That was great. The results from the trial that he showed are available on the Innovative Farmers website. You can download the results of that trial. They're also featured in a rather good wood chip handbook that's available from Chelsea Green downstairs. Thank you, Tolly. Jill, over to you.
Thank you. So, this is our nursery, taken some time ago. It's an idyllic village setting. They're even playing cricket. John took this over when he was 25, which was 1979, and we've been propagating since 1985. We were certified by the Soil Association in 97, and although that might look quite a big greenhouse to some of you, we're sort of middle-sized propagators. There are others that are much bigger than us, but we're, I think, the biggest organic propagator. There is now 3 wood chip boilers that provide heating for the greenhouses, and we have our own borehole. We have a handful of really big growers, but the vast majority of our customers are small. And as Ben said earlier on in another session, the middle has been squeezed out. You're either a large company supplying the multiples or a small company doing box schemes, CSAs, or farmers markets. So we say we grow anything from seed, and we pretty much have over the years. That's the breakdown of the main crops we do. So a big chunk of it is brassicas. The segments that are checked are the ones that we grow in blocks. And I'll explain why we do some in blocks. So the majority of our stuff is in modules, and only the celery and the leafy salads are in blocks. So this is leeks, as Tolly said. They're very small modules. Most of the modules we use are slightly bigger than that, but that's the minimum size. And we have gantries, which you can't see in this picture, but so our watering is incredibly accurate. We don't waste any watering, or we waste very little compared to when we used to have spinners, because if you've got a spinner, then you have circular patterns. You have to overlap them in order to cover all the crops, and then you end up with some areas that are overwatered. So when we moved on to gantries, we used a lot less water, and we use the gantries for feeding as well. Most things grow okay without feeding, but not leeks, because they've got such a long growing season, and they're also in tiny modules. So although that's a whole lorry full of leeks, that's why I took a picture of it, because it's unusual. A lot of our stuff goes out in half pallets or pallets of mixed plants, because most of the people that are growing for direct markets want a few trays of this, that and the other every week, because that's what they're supplying to their customers. Whilst I think about it, yes, you can hold plants almost indefinitely in this system. With brassicas, you can hold them for a year, and Bob Hiron at Curtin, he showed that you could hold brassica plants for a whole year and then feed them and start them off again. I mean, you can't do that with lettuce, but certainly with brassicas you can. And the other advantage of using modules over peg plants is that if you've got a high pH soil, then club root's not likely to be a problem. But if you're growing peg plants in the soil, you would have to be very careful that you rotated it and you didn't have any club root or other disease build-up. So, we used to do mail order, and that was a good way of trying out Peat-Free. So we had over 100 different products, and from 2012 we grew all those in peat-free compost. So we already knew it wasn't a problem for us. You could grow any of the common vegetables in it, but the modules, the lettuce we sold mail order were grown in modules because people are going to hand plant them. Everything was in modules, and so everything could be peat-free. And we were getting rather hacked off with people spreading fake news about peat-free being, you know, an insurmountable problem. So we set up our own trial. This was in 2013. We got friend, my daughter's partner, who was a mathematician, he did the stats. It's proper randomised block. The Soil Association paid for the write-up to be turned into a poster. And we pretty much showed that for lettuce, Chinese cabbage and cabbages, there weren't any problems with growing in peat-free. So the conclusion we came to is that we couldn't understand why anybody's making a fuss about growing plants in modules in peat-free compost. But if you remember my little checked segments, you cannot mechanically plant a lettuce block by picking it up by the plant because it's too delicate. So the only way to mechanically plant it is to hold the blocks. So we make the blocks that are in, they're sort of in like a chocolate block, like a chocolate bar. They're cut all the way down in one direction and only half the way down in the other direction. And then as it comes off the planting machine, each plant drops off. So the planting machine doesn't touch the lettuce, and it's planted at perfect depth without any damage. And we use this for celery as well, because most of the celery we grow is for a big company that use mechanical planting. Now, I really apologise for this. I had a video of planting lettuce blocks, but I had a technical fail and I didn't embed the video. But if you go onto YouTube afterwards and look at Ferrari rotostrat transplanting, you see perfectly well what I mean. So it has people sitting on the blocking machine have like a metal scoop. They take the 6 plants in and they shove them down a chute, and then as the plants come off the back of the planter, they're broken off and press wheels just squeeze them together nicely. Right, so we've solved, at least to our criteria, we've solved modules. How do we solve the blocking problem? And because we're growing a huge number of plants and we're growing them to very specific timings, the growing media needs to be 100% reliable and consistent. And we have had very expensive failures in the past where with organic compost, where somebody decided that they would switch the nitrogen source in the compost without telling us. And as you probably know, you can get slow-release nitrogen and get very quick-release nitrogen. We had very, very quick release of too much ammonium, scorched a load of tomato plants, cost us a lot of money. So you've got to be able to trust the firm that you're buying it from. So it has to be suitable for mechanical planting. You need to do trials to make sure that the plants establish and grow on well, and it shouldn't be too expensive. I mean, we could have moved on to modules for our wholesale business earlier than we have, but it costs about 12.5% extra, and we were reluctant to pass that on to our customers. But from this year, from last year, from beginning of 2022, we've been completely peat-free on the nursery for all the modules, all the stuff we sell in our shop, which is flowers in pots and things like that, and only the blocks have had peat in them. Thank you. Right, so Defra and the AHDB, which is the Agriculture and Horticultural Development Board, they commissioned some trials to look at transition to sustainable growing media. That figure's actually wrong. It was £1 million, including what Defra put in, over 5 years, and they didn't solve the blocking problem, mainly because they limited themselves to those materials, and you can't make blocks from those materials because the peat is quite humified in blocking compost, and it's greasy. It needs to form a block that holds together, dries out and forms a stable block, and then holds together until you plant it. And none of those materials on their own will fit that bill. So we're still looking, is the answer. We're still looking for something that has the same properties as humified peat, that will provide the glue to hold the blocks together. And it needs to be sustainable, and it needs to be available consistently in big enough quantities. So in the future, we are still currently trying to find a peat-free medium, so we're trying to widen the net, widen the field to other materials other than the ones that are commonly used in propagation in peat-free composts. But until we can find something to make blocks out of, the only other option is to move over to pot modules or peg plants. But for big growers, then you've got to find a mechanical way of planting those plants at scale. And there's nothing there at the moment. So the cost of setting up, if you're a small grower, it's perfectly possible to set up to grow plants in modules and hand plant your lettuces. But to scale that up, it's very expensive going into propagation because you've got to have at least a polytunnel, if not glass houses. You need trays, a tray filler, seeders, gantries, and so on. And so I can't see at the moment a way of scaling up to do block plants unless we can come up with a new material that nobody's tried yet. And that's the holy grail, really. Other than that, then we go over to modules or peg plants and find a new way of planting them. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. So, I mean, it's quite optimistic. I mean, there's a few specific challenges around certain systems, but for most crops, in most situations, there shouldn't be a big barrier. So I'm going to ask Becky just to say a couple of bits about the innovative farmers, and then we're going to have questions. I'm going to take, Chloe, I'm going to start with one from online, if that's all right, from John at the front, and then I'll sort of alternate between questions from the room and questions from those that are watching it live stream.
To the programme which I'm involved in. My name's Rebecca Swin and I manage a programme called Innovative Farmers. Tolly has been involved, it used to be called the Dutchy Future Farming Programme, thanks to the main sponsors of the programme. But yes, now it's known as Innovative Farmers. And we are here to essentially fill a gap in agricultural R&D where not enough funding is going towards farmer-led ideas for research and innovation. So we wanted to fill that gap by being able to provide some support, including the ability to apply for a small pot of funding for the research to happen. We also help groups of farmers to get together and matchmake them with a researcher and someone to project manage and coordinate what we call them as field labs. That's just the trials. So we also have really good links with the farming media and provide and create a lot of different types of material to get the results out. Everything is open source and published on our website. And we also arrange various events and workshops through the year so that even if you're not involved, you can still find out, learn more, exchange what you know with other farmers and growers as well. This target of trying to achieve sort of peat-free organic horticulture by 2025 is going to just come up without us even knowing it. That's quite concerning, and I would really, really love to see at least one field lab on the topic of, peat-free horticulture. I very much welcome your ideas for what you'd like to look into if you're a grower. We have a sign-up sheet at the front, and I'll try and get some at the back if you're leaving the room. And if you're interested in being involved, please, please just put your details down on that form. I actually realised I did have one more slide. This is just a bit more about the programme, and we've actually launched 120 of these field labs over around 600 farms since the programme started 10 years ago. Get in touch or come and see me at the end, or you can speak to Ben as well. Great, thank you.
Thank you, Becky. So, first question from our online viewers.
Hello. Yeah. I think this one's directed at Margi. How does the UK responsibly sourcing scheme account for a product if is a byproduct of something that isn't very sustainable? How much of the main product's footprint is included in the byproduct's production?
So if a material is what's called a virgin material, but a virgin material that is a byproduct, so say the coconut, for example, then you would look from the start of the production of the for example, with regards to water and energy use of the production of the coconuts. But of course, the coir we use is only a small part. So you count the whole water use and energy use, but you apportion it to the proportion of that production that the coconut dust or the coir. So is this all apportioned to, I mean, obviously lots of it goes out for the coconuts themselves, for the fibres and whatever, but so it's apportioned according to a percentage sort of worked out that the coir production. By value or by weight? I can't. I think it's by weight. But it is absolutely by weight because it's done on a sort of dry matter production band.
And I was interested in the social impact line. Yeah. And I noticed that you gave wood chip a red. Yeah. Is that because how do you with something like that? I mean, with Tolly's, it's just coming from a tree surgeon and. No. It's because we've done it according to the calculate. What I was trying to say, I'm just trying to move it back here. Because there was one where I showed, there's me, isn't it? Oh. So here you can see for all the materials,
the social compliance is red, actually apart from COIA. And that's a sort of a bit of an anatomy of how the calculator works at the moment. So by social compliance, they're basically looking at what employment sort of regulations are in place. And in order to score higher than a red, you need to have an externally audited social compliance audit done.
Okay.
And I mean, it's really detailed down. For a coconut producer, it would be for all the coconut producers have to have an externally audited system. And of course, the retailers in general, in horticultural retailers, don't tend to insist on that for materials produced domestically. So the wood fibres also score a red. Green waste compost also score a red, because although the green waste compost is produced in this country, it's deemed as low risk.
Okay. So
they never have an externally audited system in place. So it's a bit of an anomaly, but it's the same for all, basically. And you can see it's the same for pollution. Pollution always scores, and I think for yours as well, a yellow. And that's also a bit like, unless you can... So, I mean, yours has it's basically done on, have there been any pollution incidents, if it's an open windrow composting system, basically. And you have had no incidents of pollution, but unless you can prove that you have had no pollutions, i.e. you are monitoring it, which you can really only do in an in-vessel composting plant, say, for example, then you can't... So I suppose it shows how rigorous and detailed it is.
But then you run into the challenges of that.
Yeah. So you have to sort of live with some of the reds that you can't do much about, basically.
So we're not using slave labour, really?
No.
Great, thank you. So a question for them. Right at the back, yeah.
Thanks. Gareth Hughes. I work for a small workers' co-op in Derbyshire, and we grow perennial edibles in peat-free compost. So just a comment, really, that we've done some experiments with biochar and cutting silver mix with biochar and found that to be very, very successful. So I recommend you all do that. And the other question, I'm really sorry I came in late, so I didn't catch all of the names, but the question about blocking mixes, I wonder if you've looked at Dalefoot at all. Dalefoot compost, is it?
I believe that's made from wool.
Wool and bracken.
Wool and bracken. We've tried it for hanging baskets, but it doesn't have the right characteristics to glue together and make a block.
Okay, yeah, we've just found it to be it's quite wet, isn't it? And it sort of crusts, really, is it? In my experience, it kind of gets that crust to it, so I don't know if that would...
So I did notice there was another question actually while you're there, and then we'll come back to the front. There was an online and a question at the front as well.
Hi, sorry. I've got a question about how is the organics recycling group involved in creating that peat-free medium, since their members process 1.9 million tons of green waste a year? Thank you.
You can answer that one. I mean, our experience started actually with using green waste compost before we got onto wood chip, and in those days it seemed like the cool thing to be doing. I mean, I think the concerns now really are around microplastics. I think that is the reason perhaps we haven't done any work on it for many, many years. I don't know what's happened.
I think commercially, when in the 80s and early 90s, particularly in the early 90s, there were a lot of growing media manufacturers using green waste compost. Then sort of came the wood fibre, and that was simpler for them to use. The reason why they don't generally like commercial, or at least then didn't like it for commercial growing, was the inherent nutrient content, which is sort of difficult to manage, which we as organic growers often want, but it can still be quite difficult to manage. So, in fact, you've seen in recent years, in the last 5 years, less of the commercial, basically less green waste compost is being used in the commercial medium. And the ones that are using it, what they have normally have to resort to is really source their green waste compost really, really carefully. And some of the companies actually produce their own green waste compost in order to, so they take in material from local authorities, but they have a full handle on the whole composting process, because what they're particularly worried about is the contamination of sharps and glass in it, basically, because that's a sort of then a health and safety issue when it's being used.
And I think, I mean, am I right in that you're sort of also asking whether the organic recycling group were involved in the process as well as whether the green compost is used? Is that right? So, you know, so effectively the group of manufacturers that regulate and contribute to that, were they involved in the responsible
there has been green waste compost producers involved in the process. Yes, there has been. Yeah, there have been, definitely. I think specifically Veolia has been involved on the committee.
So the blocking compost we use contains 20% green waste, but it's, as Margi said, it's produced by the manufacturer of the growing media. And so we can trust its source.
But it's definitely the material that we are going to have to learn to use, because, I mean, that's what makes most sense from a sort of resource use point of view. We've got plenty of it available. Surely we can sort out a fraction of all of that. We don't need massive volumes in relation to the volumes of green waste compost that we have. And I think there are some sort of early indications as well that even for a blocking medium, which you say is a sort of a well-humified sedge, it's a different type of peat that's used for that. It's usually sedge peat.
No, not anymore. It's just sphagnum from lower down.
From lower down, so but it's really humified. And so some people have found some success with, if you like, really humified green waste compost as well, so really old green waste compost. And I think your wood-based compost as well would work if it was really well decomposed, basically. So that's what we're hoping anyway.
Thank you. So we'll take another online, and there was a question at the front as well.
Just to throw a few more suggestions out there for the blocking conundrum. Someone's saying, for the glue, why not clay? There's a question. And there was another one about a seaweed extract. Could that be used to try and bind things together? And then a question for Margi. How do the peat-free alternatives compare with peat-based for cost? And yeah, that's it. I'll come back.
Cool. So, and then Jill, actually, I think you mentioned a bit about the cost difference as well, didn't you?
Yeah.
Do you want to start on the...
Okay, well, our module compost is 12.5% more expensive if it's peat-free compared to an organic compost from the same manufacturer.
Per tray, per module?
Per cubic metre of growing media.
Okay.
And you use about the same amount, so it's...
So relatively small? Or is
if you asked some of these growers, would you like 12% hike in one of your inputs? Yeah, but I mean, as far as clay goes, that's a possibility, but it would add a lot of weight to it. So definitely, I'm open to any suggestion. Seaweed extract, why not?
Yeah. As well as clay, I understand that some sort of other dust materials, brick dust and stuff that has been used. But the problem, or some sort of dust or minerals, but the problem is that they don't work through the mechanisation. They're too abrasive on the machinery. So, I mean, I think the seaweed, I don't know if seaweed extract would work, but sort of the glutinous stuff of fresh seaweed, I think, is something perhaps worth looking into.
Yeah. We have done some trials with our substrate and blocking, and it was remarkably successful. I mean, I wasn't expecting it. I mean, by the way, I didn't actually say what goes into our substrate. It's wood chip, which is composted for up to 2 years. It goes through a 10mm sieve that's graded at 10mm, and to that we add around 25% vermiculite, nothing else. It's so simple it's almost untrue. You must think I'm making it up. It's that simple. However, for blocking, I thought this is never going to work. So when you set up a trial, the thing you don't want to do is try and make up your own mind about how it's going to work from the beginning, because you're always going to want it to be positive. I went into it with a really negative attitude, thinking, this is not going to work. I couldn't believe how successful it was. In fact, you have a picture on your slide of one of my blocks. It's my hand holding that block.
Yes, I think it is,
right?
yeah.
And we did it with Calabrese, which is a relatively simple crop to grow. We did it with Calabrese, we did a bare root transplant comparison, and we did a module comparison to see what the difference was. The module one wasn't quite as good as the blocking one. The blocking one actually turned out better. Now, when I blocked this, I made it really wet. It was like tomato paste. It was almost liquid, right? It looked horrendous. It was a horrible, solid mass of goo into which we transplanted tiny little seedlings, pricking out, and I really didn't think it was going to work. It worked really well. The reason we don't do it is primarily because for us, blocking is going to be an expensive operation. We're not geared up for it. We're not doing millions. We're only doing tens of thousands. We don't have the kit to do it. But I'm quite confident we could be blocking that material with no additional material added. We need further trials, and I've asked other people to give it a go because it might work for me, it may not work for other people, but I think it has got potential. And the reason it works, I think, is because the wood chip is so decomposed. It's like black dust. It really is. You can blow it and it just disappears into the air. It's so fine. So I think
maybe
it has
that's
got
the
potential.
field lab.
Yeah, send us some and we'll put it through
Well,
the machine.
I will send you some if you want
There you
to
go.
give it a try. You know, it may not work in commercial blocking.
But we'll give it a go.
We're just using a little Mickey Mouse, you know, nine block thing at a time. The other thing about blocking, which I hadn't really identified because we gave it up many years ago, was it actually took up slightly less space in the propagation area. You haven't got all the plastic. And that's an advantage as well. For the same size, the same CC unit of block as a module was taking up less space. By about 10%, which is not a lot, but if you're on a big scale, that might be significant. You might be able to bring your prices down by 10%.
Can I say something on the price?
Yeah, sorry,
Peat-Free media. I mean, to be absolutely honest, I don't know. What I've heard over all the years up until recently when we looked at this is that the peat-free media are going to be more expensive. And the problem I would say is not that the peat-free media are more expensive, it's that peat is far too cheap. And that's one reason why this whole thing has been delayed as well, because you've basically got the growing media manufacturers are almost exclusive, not all of them. There are some that have specialized on bark and wood fiber and stuff like that, but most of them are also peat producers. And they have paid for their licensees to extract the peat many years ago. They have got they've sort of written off all their costs, so they're basically selling the peat, you know, it still obviously sells at the price, but if they can keep the prices really, really low because there are no costs with it, basically. So whatever we replace it with, it's going to be more expensive than peat.
So we need a peat tax.
Yeah. Yeah, good idea.
Well, I voted no for that because I think that will just further delay. It will just basically an excuse to, okay, we'll pay a bit more for the peat, but I just think we just basically need to stop farting about it, stop it, using it now, basically.
Okay, Joe and then Guy.
Thanks to all of you. Really, really interesting. I had a question for Iain about the peg planting, because when you were talking about the pros of it, you had like a bulleted list, and I think you might have skipped past the independent that was on the list. So you'd like talked about why it was cheaper, hardier, less energy intensive, and more flexible, but I can't remember what you said about independent unless I misheard it. And also, I was wondering if there were any limits to the kinds of plants you can peg plant, because I got the impression that things like salads wouldn't work. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, there are limits. I mean, you wouldn't do lettuce. I mean, it can be done, but it's not sensible. There are a range of plants you wouldn't do. Tomatoes, incidentally, in many countries are grown as peg plants. It's only really in the sort of European standard we do in modules. I didn't quite understand what you were inferring in terms of independence.
Should we find your slide?
Yeah. See, I've forgotten already what I was presenting. Go on.
And then also on this topic, Ben.
Independent. Yeah, independent from all the
Propagators.
kind of infrastructure you need in terms of, you know, the electricity, the greenhouses, the trays, the plastic, all that kind of stuff, really. You know, it's a much simpler system. It doesn't have the infrastructure you have with modules. That's what I meant by independent. And also, you're independent from, you know, suppliers as well. You are more self-sufficient within your farm. I think that's what I was getting at.
Particularly if you then start growing your own seed.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe a couple of points on that.
They all think we're going to be doing.
Just on this point, there's a question around: do you have slug problems in your nursery with plants? Do you have any? No, Tolly.
Me?
Yeah.
No, this question comes up every single time. Whenever I do a farm walk, there's two questions I know I'm going to get. One's about slugs, the other is, do you raise all your own seed? They must think I'm a complete purist. No, we don't do all our own seed. Slugs are not a problem at all. I mean, and I think it's very difficult to answer this because people want a very easy and uncomplicated, oh, you have to use so-and-so. It's not like that. It's about developing a system. We have massive slug problems when we started. It was horrendous. We actually got ducks in to deal with it. That did work very well until the foxes gradually took the ducks away, by which time we'd built up enough biodiversity on the ground in terms of beetles. Beetles are the real ally you need for slug control. And also simple things like making sure your pH is up high enough to, you know, discourage slugs. There's lots of things. It's not a simple answer, but no problems at all with slugs. We get very occasionally, you might get it too, the odd rogue snail that gets in to the greenhouse and suddenly 10 plants have gone in a row and you have to pick all the trays up and look for this slug. You have to stand like this and look up, you've done this, you're looking for a snail or a tiny slug. And then we chuck it out, and that's it. But that's the only time in fact, that's probably the only time we've ever lost any plants, is due to the odd rogue snail. Yeah. In terms of bare roots, it's much less a problem. With peg plants, you don't get the slug problem you would get perhaps in a greenhouse.
So, Guy and then Sally, and then we'll have another online question.
Yeah, just say thank you to all of you for all the work you've done on this over the years, particularly you, Margie. So, peg plants, I'd absolutely delight to hear you advocating them. Tolly, sorry, Delphine.
No, we're not going to put you out of business, Gio,
yeah, like you, you know, I started off doing all peg plants, and I'm slightly bemused why we abandoned them so easily, particularly for leeks, actually. And we have actually gone back to using pretty much all peg plants for leeks. They are so much better.
Oh, so much
I mean, in addition to your advantage, you can plant them later, definitely more robust in the drought year. It spreads your planting season out more. I just think there's no excuse for, certainly other than early plants, for growing leeks in modules. Unfortunately, we used to grow our own plants, but I guess commercial pressures and being busy at that time of year, they are all imported from Holland. And I think there's a real opportunity for someone to do peg plants commercially, leeks, in the UK. I think we just really need someone. I think they're harvested by something like a carrot harvester, leek harvester. They're certainly, the price they come in, they're certainly not pulled up by hand. I think it's going to take a little bit more to go back to pegs for brassicas, though I do think the open pollinated, we still grow a few open pollinated, purple sprouting and so on, and I think that is a real possibility. But thanks to all of you. Yeah, well, really good points, Guy. I think anybody that raises plants, you have to be incredibly tough. I am in awe and admiration for anybody that can deal with Joe Farmer and grower in terms of raising plants. I know we used to do strawberry plants years ago. We were the only organic strawberry plants in the whole world at one time, and we were developing over 500,000 plants a year, and we were dealing with growers, and it's an absolute and total nightmare. It really is. So anybody who takes on peg plants, it's going to have to be really tough. And it is a really good opportunity for somebody, but it's a hard business to deal with. Sorry, one more to answer for them is that, I mean, there's no weed control. You can't do a peg plant.
Yeah, yeah.
You never have to have it.
No.
It's that much stronger straight away. It's a no-brainer.
Absolutely. And leeks, as you say, Guy, leeks are an absolute no-brainer. Why you would ever bother putting leeks in modules is beyond me.
So we've got a question for Sally, then I'm going to do online, and then to the front.
Thank you. I've been looking at what happens in the States, because obviously they're very fixated on peat over there. And increasingly growers are using a material called pit moss, which is a recycled paper-based product, and it's getting quite good reviews. So I just wondered whether that had arrived in the Europe or UK yet.
I've not come across
No,
it.
I think, I don't know what that particular is. Actually, when I was saying the dust, paper sludge is the one that has been used,
Yeah, we did try
mixed
that.
in a trial to produce a blocking compost. But I don't know of that particular.
It broke the chain on the blocking machine.
Oh, yeah, well, no, that's the same
It doesn't
problem,
mean
that it's
to-
abrasive, isn't it?
It doesn't mean to say that you couldn't do it. But, you know, you could vary the product and use it, but we have tried it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think in most, I mean, there are, of course, lots of countries where they never got into using peat, and they tend to use forestry byproducts, including bark, by the main, basically, instead, or have always developed that to a much greater degree.
So we don't know is the short answer. So, John, a couple more.
Yeah, I'll see if I can bundle a few together. So the first one, bit of a statement and a question, may be contentious, but should we take account of extraction of resources from developing countries which they might need themselves? Are we continuing an imperialist and extractive system? That's from Rosie. And then another one, if existing machines are unable to deal with peat-free blocks and we need the mechanised planting for large-scale plantings, should our efforts go towards changing, amending the machines rather than the blocks? Is that not possible?
I would certainly agree that there's a risk of exploiting other people's fertility by bringing it over here. But
Yeah, no, I would totally agree. I mean, at the moment, that doesn't come up in the responsible sourcing calculator, which you would have thought perhaps be considered for Koya, for example. But I think it's often raised, and there are lots of people, even within the organic movement, we have some sort of consideration. Is it really right to? I mean, we always used to talk about that. You know, that organic matter would be better used, you know, in Sri Lanka or India, or wherever it's produced. I think it's more robbing it for another use. It's often used for fuel, and that is perhaps more sort of greater consideration. So I think you're absolutely right. If we really looked at this closer, even closer, then I think we should start taking that into consideration. And that's why, I guess, in Organic Plus, we have been trying to look at using local, ideally on-farm produced resources, like Tolly is doing. The Spanish partners have been heavily involved in the Organic Plus project, and they normally have sort of good cooperation between the farmers and the local sort of foresters. And there is a lot of effort has gone into using forestry byproducts, which they often have to clear because of the fire hazards, basically. So they collect a lot of forestry byproducts, and that's why there's been a lot of focus on that, seen as a local resource that could be very effectively used.
I would definitely say that the machinery's got to be looked at, but it's getting the funding to do it. It would be expensive. And if I could be very cheeky, I've got a question for Tolly.
Go on.
What do you think it is about the vermiculite? Could you possibly substitute that for something like fine bark or?
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a really good question. I have endless sleepless nights over vermiculite. Because it comes from Portugal. It's a rock material. It's treated by heat. It takes a lot of energy. It's a fossil fuel, obviously, issue. It's a carbon issue. We want to replace it. We have tried various things. We tried local sharp sand, which has a much lower carbon footprint because it comes from the quarry just 5 miles away. It's not very practical. It doesn't hold moisture. It drains too rapidly. And then one of the reasons we mixed vermiculite is really to reduce the nitrogen content of our substrate, which is too high. So we use it for various purposes, but also it holds moisture and it helps drainage. Now that's, again, quite a difficult material to substitute for. We would much rather have a local material. I'm not, the product you're talking about could well be useful. I mean, we need to look at this. We need a little bit of help and support. As growers, we can do only so much. We need some help and support from whatever bodies are around who want to look at the alternative materials that should be available, because we would much rather use something which is either on our doorstep or something very close.
Yeah, when we tried I think those were the slides I skipped, we tried to substitute the vermiculite with extruded wood fibre, which I think would have it would dilute it, and it would sort of improve the drainage as well, which could work. What we found, it's quite difficult to get hold of extruded wood, and where it's the growing manufacturers who produce it, they basically what we found when we mixed it in, we got a real clear nitrogen sort of robbery effect. So it would need to be mixed in together with some additional nitrogen to remove that effect. But I think from a physical point of view, it could certainly work, and from a mopping up of some of the nitrogen as well. But the problem is it's not going to re-release it. That's the issue.
I mean, there's always a risk element when you start dabbling. I mean, our system, you know, I got the view that if it's not broke, don't fix it, you know. And, you know, it does work. And to start trying other materials is a risky business, and we need some support from somewhere to do that. And same for you, you know, you're not going to risk doing novel material techniques because, you know, your business is at stake, you know. And this is why so many growers have not adopted any new materials for plant raising. It's a big risk.
Well, I mean, even worse than that. So in one of the trials I did 10 years ago, I was working with some peat-free materials, and one grower, we did a trial with some peat and the one that he was using, and the peat-based one was so good, he went away from using the peat-free. He said, bloody hell, all my stuff's actually germinating now. I've been struggling away with this substandard material for years. So there is a challenge there. There's a question at the front. No? Okay. Well, let's have one from the back then. The lady with the green top.
I was at a wheat event called Grain Lab in May, and there's a woman there who has a big mill in Maine in America, and as part of a diversification, she's got quite a few other businesses based in the mill, and there's one that started up using wheat bran that's left over from the milling as a vermiculite replacement, and they've had success with that. Right. I was just wondering if anybody else up has come across people doing that or experimented with it.
No.
No.
We're all excited about that one. Excellent.
In the early, I mean, one of the first materials that I worked on when I joined Garden Organic in the late 80s was spent brewer's grain. There used to be some, I think, organically approved materials based on spent brewer's grain, and depending on how that had been treated, I can't remember what they did to it, you could see that some of the sort of the grain materials would be left as it could be used as a yeah. I mean, I don't know of a commercial growing medium that is still using brewer's grain. I don't know what happened to.
Oh, we could definitely get a bit of wheat bran to try, Tolly.
Yeah. I mean, the problem with wheat bran, it is a product of white flour, and I might have a big problem with that because I don't actually agree with wheat bran. So, you know, it depends how far your ethics go, I suppose.
But even like someone like Rosie, who bakes kind of mostly wholemeal, that she was doing a talk yesterday, we did an extraction with her mill, and there was still a 7% wheat bran left over that she can't even mix back in. She uses most of the mids, so her extraction is 91%, but there's still some there, and if you look at the scale of production of flour, that's still quite a lot of.
So providing the social responsibility stacks up, yeah, why not? I mean, you need to score this one now.
But presumably it will break down quite quickly, though. It's not as resilient as it's not.
But it doesn't need to last that long, does it?
No, it's only 5-6 weeks in general, or even less in some cases.
Yeah.
So yes, it might well. I'm sure there's a huge number of products out there that we could potentially be trialling. There always is. You know, we're stuck with so few materials because our mindset is that way. I think there's lots of opportunities.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Elephant grass or miscanthus as a growing medium, highly absorbent.
Yeah.
I'll talk to you later.
No, well, I haven't tried it, but there have been some products produced with it as well, yeah.
The lady in the middle, and then we'll have a final one from online. I think that will be it then.
Shall I go?
Go, yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. How much discussion is there between farmers and big suppliers about innovations that they're doing on farm? And where are those for? Like, where do those conversations take place?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way the innovative farmers is that. I don't think probably enough of those conversations do take place. And I think one of the challenges with the polarisation of scale in horticulture particularly, is that the very big companies have R&D budgets that allow them to develop stuff that, you know, is useful to them and suits it. And growers like Tolly and the smaller scale growers don't have any of that, and so they do stuff anyway because farmers always innovate, but they don't have the support or the links to, you know, whether it's a compost manufacturer, whoever it is, and so it does become harder. So in a way that, yeah, it's exactly sort of why Innovative Farmers is here, is to help with those linking with researchers and with industries.
I mean, I think generally in the horticultural sector in the UK, this whole work on phasing out peat has been, the growers have been very much involved. So it's been the growing media manufacturers, but also the growers. And of course here, we are now talking about a very sort of a small bit of the whole use of peat. We are talking for propagation, which is really a sort of a tiny bit. Most of the work on replacing peat has been done for ornamental production, basically. And where I would say the issue has been also been largely resolved. I mean, the RHS is also set on phasing out peat by 2025 because and they are mainly concerned about much larger pots or growing in much larger pots. And there the issues, I mean, we are dealing with the most tricky area growing in these small cells, really.
And I would say, you know, I know that we're not there yet and we want to be peat-free, but actually the organic sector has been further ahead of anybody over the years. You know, the RHS says they're going peat-free. They're not going peat-free on the food in their cafe. They're going peat-free in their pots. You know, so we are, you know, we have been at the forefront. These, you know, all of you have been doing this stuff for decades. And there's still things we need to solve, but I think we can be, you know, we can be a bit proud of what we've achieved and where we've gone, even though
and I guess it looks like we are sort of dragging behind, but that is because we are dealing with the most difficult bit. But that's also because we haven't got many organic ornamental growers. We haven't got a big nursery.
And most, you know, most small-scale organic growers haven't used peat for years.
No, exactly.
You know, so just because you can use peat doesn't mean everybody is using peat. You know, so there's an element of
But we need to be able to shout about it. And so we need to be completely peat-free, and then we can shout.
Yeah. A final question from online.
This one's from Mick. Do you think the ban on peat-based compost will speed commercial sector to think about what they're doing? And then a sort of last thought from Daniel. Is there a cost-effective way of introducing a leaf mould compost at scale?
Well, the ban I can comment on. I think that will definitely happen. So I don't know if I didn't really mention that, but it has now been that they are going to ban the retail sale of peat from 2024 in this country, in all sectors, basically. And so the target for banning it or for phasing it out by 2020 was missed, but in response to that, the voluntary target has now been agreed that's going to be, for the retail sector, it's not going to be voluntary anymore, it's going to be a mandatory target to phase it out by 2024. And interestingly, Defra has also confirmed that they have brought the target for the commercial sector forward to 2028 rather than 2030, which was originally. And the reason for that is that once you can't sell peat in bags or you can't sell plant grown in peats in garden centres or whatever, it's going to be very difficult for the commercial nursery growers to operate. I mean, what are they going to? Who are they going to sell to? The sector that is left is this sector here, isn't it? The commercial plant producers, basically. But the nurseries, most of the nursery producers, it's definitely going to spur them on to.
And we haven't talked about mushrooms.
Well, the leaf mould, the leaf mould one is an interesting one because when I first started doing our own substrates for plant raising many years ago, we did actually use leaf mould, and it's got a wonderful material. It's got great credit, and it was always used. It's been used, you know, since Victorian times and before. That's okay up to a point, and then you suddenly start this social responsible sourcing thing, and I started getting paranoid about going out in the woods and taking trailloads of leaf mould because you're actually taking fertility from somewhere else. If you look at the environment under leaf mould, it's seriously rich fungal biodiversity going on there, which you are actually destroying. So I think, you know, the same issues around leaf mould, perhaps comparing with the extraction of peat. If you were to take large amounts of leaf mould out of woodlands, you are degrading that environment quite badly, and the trees live on that material. And this is why forests continue forever, because they have that biological function with the soil, which comes from leaf mould and decaying timber. So I think it's not a viable alternative, other than very, very small scale. If you've got a big area of wood near you and you're taking just a few barrel loads, I think that's okay. But large-scale extraction, I think, would be a complete no-no.
And for me, this is where the whole circular bit comes in again. And you get, you know, if you start planting your own short rotation agroforestry coppice in your system, you get the biodiversity benefit, the windbreak benefit, you know, all of that stuff. You then coppice it, wood chip, and you've got your own propagation compost. So it's giving you multiple benefits. You know, so thinking, you know, you use some of your willow for that. You know, it's more than just, okay, you've got to, how much of it can you produce yourself? You're in control of it. It's part of your system then. You're not importing someone else's, you know, you're robbing someone else or importing a problem. Everything you bring onto your farm is a risk as well. So, you know.
So, yeah, the word independent is about control.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, thank you all very much. Thank you to my speakers. And thank you to Becky for organising the session, to all of you online, and for great questions in the room. Thank you.